Tonight, we drift through candlelit halls and whispered secrets to discover what love, lust, and marriage truly meant in the medieval world. It begins with the sound of rain, gentle, rhythmic, unhurried. It taps against the warped wooden shutters of your small, drafty chamber, the way a distracted child might drum their fingers on a tabletop. The smell of damp straw rises from the floor, mingling with the faint, stubborn scent of last night's tallow candle. Somewhere far below, in the muddy courtyard, a chicken is loudly objecting to the weather. You're not sure whether to sympathize or to take notes. You probably won't make it through this day. Not because of anything especially dangerous, though yes, life expectancy in your century has an unflattering reputation, but because this is the sort of day that moves so slowly, it could lull a storm into a nap. Before we go any further, I'll just say, if you find yourself relaxing into the rhythm of this rain, the creak of beams above your head, the faint scrape of someone hauling a bucket outside, feel free to like this video so the algorithm knows you've joined our little candlelit corner of the world. And in the comments, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I promise the peasants here won't judge you a much. Now let's ease into tonight's journey. You shuffle to the doorway, tugging a coarse wool cloak over your tunic. Out in the passage, the air is thick with the smell of smoke and a distant hint of brewing ale. A scent you've learned is part comfort, part caution. Your boots squelch in the damp straw as you make your way toward the great hall, where the fire is already lit and snapping softly. It's here, in the glow of that hearth, that you're reminded of the strange, layered world you inhabit. For while we're here to talk about intimacy, love, lust, and everything in between, the medieval understanding of such matters is woven into the fabric of life itself. Marriage isn't just a personal affair. It's an alliance, a survival tactic, and occasionally, an elaborate chess move played by families who speak more in contracts than in whispers. One major fact, in case you're wondering, in much of medieval Europe, the Church held tremendous authority over marriage. By the 12th century, canon law had established that marriage was a sacrament, a holy, indissoluble union, which sounds very solemn, until you realize that, in practice, couples sometimes declared themselves married simply by agreeing aloud in front of witnesses, occasionally in a field, sometimes barefoot, sometimes in the middle of a village argument. The fire pops, sending a spray of tiny sparks into the dim air, and you remember that, just last week, someone told you of a wedding where the groom's family forgot the bread for the feast and served porridge instead. Guests pretended not to notice. Historians still debate whether love matches were rare or simply unrecorded, buried under the formalities of property exchanges and dowries. It's possible many couples cared deeply for each other in private, even if the public story was all about cattle and land. In the hall, a servant girl sweeps the rushes on the floor, a mixture of straw, herbs, and, unfortunately, whatever the dog dragged in. She hums under her breath, a tune that sounds suspiciously like the one you heard at last week's market, only slower, lazier, softened into something almost like a lullaby. You find yourself matching your steps to her rhythm, and for a moment you could forget the wider world. But this is not just a world of hearth fires and easy songs. Talk of intimacy here is shrouded in both rules and rumor. You'll hear it in the way a matron lowers her voice when speaking of the marriage bed, as if naming it aloud might knock a saint from a stained glass window. You'll see it in the sidelong glances exchanged between young people at festivals, half hope, half mischief, and entirely subject to the watchful eyes of their elders. There is, of course, an obscure little tidbit the village swears by, that placing rosemary under your pillow can inspire romantic dreams or ward off unwanted ones, depending on how it's arranged. No one agrees on the science, but everyone agrees it smells nicer than unwashed linen. Outside, the rain eases, leaving behind a silver sheen on the muddy yard. You step into the doorway for a breath of cool air and notice two figures passing under the dripping eaves. A pair of young lovers, perhaps, though they walk several paces apart. Whether out of modesty, custom, or simply because the mud between them is impassable, you can't quite tell. And so you stand, watching the day unfold in its own patient way, knowing we have much to cover before the sun slips back behind the clouds. The stories here are quiet, but they run deep, and somewhere between the creak of the beams and the hiss of the hearth, you'll hear them. The rain has stopped entirely now, though the sky still hangs low and heavy, like an old wool blanket that's been wrung out but not quite dried. The air carries that after-rain smell, wet earth, soot from chimney smoke, and the faint sweetness of trampled mint that grows in the yard without anyone remembering to plant it. You wander back into the great hall just in time to catch the tail end of the morning meal. It's not glamorous. Bread, a wedge of hard cheese, and ale thin enough to make you wonder if someone accidentally dropped a bucket of water in the cask. A boy you vaguely know from the kitchen carries off a tray of leftover scraps for the hounds, and you get the distinct impression the dogs might be eating better than you. At the high table, two older men debate something in low, urgent voices, one gesturing wildly with his crust of bread, the other shaking his head with the slow gravity of a man who knows this is going nowhere. You catch a single word in their exchange: banns. This is your reminder that before a couple can wed, the church expects their intention to be announced publicly, usually 3 Sundays in a row, to give anyone a chance to object. The idea is to prevent hasty, secretive matches, but in practice it means the entire village gets 3 full weeks to speculate on the future couple's compatibility, their family politics, and, of course, their fitness in the eyes of God and gossip. A scrap of overheard rumor drifts down the table. Apparently, last month, someone actually stood up in church during the banns to say the groom owed him a goat, and until that debt was settled, there'd be no wedding. You can't tell whether this is truth or the kind of tale that gets better with retelling, but it's delivered with enough relish to make you suspect the latter. You sip your ale and watch as a young woman, maybe 16, maybe younger, crosses the hall to speak with her mother. They stand close, speaking in hushed tones. The girl glances over her shoulder once, twice, as though afraid she'll be caught at what? Discussing her future husband? Or perhaps seeking advice on how to refuse him. Here's the thing. While we might imagine medieval unions as rigidly arranged, there were occasionally ways out. If a marriage hadn't been consummated, for instance, an annulment could be sought. Of course, proving such a thing was delicate. And if you think today's bureaucratic paperwork is a headache, imagine having to swear before God and several clergy members that nothing happened on your wedding night, while your spouse stands right there. Historians still debate just how strictly these rules were enforced outside major towns and noble courts. In smaller villages, where everyone knows each other's lives in unnerving detail, it's entirely possible that quiet compromises were reached without any priest getting involved. From the corner of the hall comes a clatter and a muffled oath. Someone's dropped a wooden trencher, sending a slice of bread tumbling under the bench. You stoop to retrieve it and notice the floor rushes have been sprinkled with crushed lavender and tansy. It's a common enough habit here, partly to mask smells, partly because old wives insist certain herbs keep away lice. Whether it works is another matter. And speaking of old wives' wisdom, there's an obscure tidbit making the rounds this month. A concoction of honey and ground pepper, taken at the right moon phase, is said to ensure marital enthusiasm. It's unclear whether this was invented by an herbalist or a particularly persuasive pepper seller, but either way you make a mental note not to test it. Through the open hall door, the yard is coming to life. Chickens waddle purposefully through puddles. A boy hauls water from the well, and a merchant's cart, laden with bolts of fabric, rattles over the stones. You remember hearing that the merchant's eldest daughter recently wed a man from 2 villages over, and that her trousseau included a fine linen shift embroidered with tiny green vines. A romantic detail, perhaps, until you learn it was her mother's work, not the groom's gift. As the hall begins to empty, you step outside again. The air is cool, the sky a dull pewter, and in the distance, a bell rings from the chapel. Someone will be baptized today, you're told. Tomorrow, perhaps, a betrothal will be announced. The rhythms of life here are slow but sure, the cycle of beginnings and bindings turning like the creak of the old mill will down by the stream. And somewhere in all this, the bands, the banisters, the bread and pepper, are the unspoken rules of desire. They're whispered over cups of ale, tucked into the folds of embroidered linen, and carried in the wary glances exchanged between those not yet bound and those bound too soon. The day stretches ahead, and you can't help feeling that we're only beginning to scratch at the surface of what love, or something like it, looked like in these slow, smoky rooms. The sky has shifted again, though not dramatically. More like a subtle tilt from pewter to a muted silver, the way a coin changes color when you turn it in your palm. There's a softness to the air now, the dampness receding, replaced by the faintest thread of wood smoke curling from some unseen hearth. You head toward the village proper, following the winding dirt track that weaves between fenced gardens and sheds leaning at improbable angles, as though conspiring in some private joke. Your boots squelch in the mud, and you briefly consider walking along the edges where grass still clings stubbornly to the ground. A dog trots past you, snout to the earth, tail high, utterly uninterested in your existence. Somewhere ahead, a woman is hanging laundry, linen shifts and tunics sagging under the weight of dampness, fluttering slightly in the occasional breeze. You catch the smell of lye soap and crushed rosemary. Today there's a wedding in the making, not the grand affair of noble halls and jeweled headpieces, but the sort of village celebration that blends solemnity, festivity, and a good deal of improvisation. The bride's family home is bustling. The doorway is crowded with relatives, neighbors, and the occasional opportunist hoping for a free cup of ale later. A boy runs past you clutching a jug almost half his size, tripping twice before making it to the door without spilling a drop. A minor miracle. Here's your first real look at the bride. She's standing near the hearth, wearing her best kirtle, a shade of faded blue that once might have been vibrant. Her hair is braided with ribbon, and she's holding her hands stiffly in front of her, not from modesty but because she doesn't know where to put them. There's a hollow behind her eyes that suggests she's been up since before dawn, helping prepare her own feast. You can't quite tell if she's excited, resigned, or simply tired, and maybe she hasn't decided yet either. This is where the practical and the romantic pull in different directions. While the church speaks of marriage as a sacred union, and troubadours spin tales of rapturous love, the reality for most villagers is more transactional. A marriage might cement land agreements, ensure a family's survival through shared labor, or just stop the neighbors from talking. If there's love, it's a pleasant extra, like finding a coin in your shoe rather than a stone. The bride's dowry, 3 hens, a small chest of linen, and a wooden spinning wheel sits neatly stacked near the door. It's less about wealth and more about utility. There's a strange, almost tender practicality in knowing that your most treasured possessions at the start of your marriage might be tools, not trinkets. The groom arrives with his family, all in decent but well-worn clothing, smelling faintly of damp wool and travel dust. He's a broad-shouldered man with a face more weathered than his years suggest, and he carries himself like someone used to heavy work. He avoids looking at the bride for the first few minutes, as though unsure how much he's allowed to smile before the vows are spoken. A hush falls over the room as the parish priest arrives. He's wearing his best vestments, well, his least worn vestments, and carries a small wooden box of holy water and a crucifix. The ceremony will be simple. A blessing outside the church, vows spoken in front of witnesses, and the exchange of whatever symbolic tokens the couple can manage. In this case, the groom offers a small iron knife, sharp, useful, and a quiet promise that he'll see to their needs. Historians still debate whether such humble tokens were common practice or just the necessity of poorer communities. But it's hard to imagine a jeweler doing much business here anyway. The couple exchanges vows in the brisk air outside the chapel. There's no organ music, just the shuffle of feet and the occasional sneeze. When the priest pronounces them wed, there's polite clapping, no whoops, no cheering. Celebration will come later, once the sun dips and the ale starts flowing. For now, it's all formality. Afterward, the guests drift toward the bride's home for the feast. Tables are set up in the yard, laden with trenchers of bread, bowls of pottage, roasted root vegetables, and a small but proud joint of pork. Someone's even brought a honey cake, which is cut into pieces the size of playing cards to make it stretch. An older woman leans over to you and whispers a tidbit. On the wedding night, it's customary for a few close friends or family members to escort the couple to their bed, sometimes even staying to watch them lie down together. Though not, she assures you with a wink, to see everything. It's meant to be symbolic, proof that the marriage is legitimate. But in a village this small, you can't help thinking it's also one more excuse for nosiness disguised as tradition. As the sun slides lower, the laughter grows louder, the ale sweeter, the songs earthier. The bride smiles now, at least in flashes, and the groom has relaxed enough to laugh at a cousin's joke. Somewhere, between the practical and the tender, something like contentment begins to settle over the new couple. And you slip away before the last jug is emptied, following the fading light toward the edge of the fields, where the path narrows and the day exhales into evening. Dusk is settling in layers now, soft and steady, like wool blankets being pulled one by one over a sleeping figure. You walk the path away from the village, past fields that lie in their winter rest, the stubble of last season's harvest stiff under the touch of frost. The wind carries the echo of singing from the wedding feast, now muted by distance. It's almost pleasant, until you remember the other side of the marriage coin. Because for every feast, there's the quiet arrangement nobody talks about in song. Tonight, in a house farther down the road, a girl of barely 14 will meet her husband for the first time since the betrothal papers were signed. She's not a bride in white, but in her everyday shift, the hem mended twice, her hair plaited tight to keep it neat. Her dowry is a single goat and the promise of labor, hers, not the goat's, though the goat will certainly work too. Medieval law recognizes marriages at surprisingly young ages, especially among the peasantry, though social customs sometimes delay them until both parties can manage a household. Still, the church doesn't forbid them outright, which means arrangements can be made early and executed early. It's a practical measure, but one that rarely asks the girl's opinion. Inside the small timber-framed house, the fire is low, more embers than flame. The new husband is talking with his father in the corner, voices low but urgent, about crop rotation and the yield from last year's barley. The girl sits on a bench by the hearth, picking at the rough wool of her sleeve. No one has told her what comes next in plain words, though she has pieced together enough from older girls teasing, whispers in the field, and the occasional bawdy verse sung at midsummer. The medieval household is not just a family, it's an economic unit. A marriage means two labor forces combining, and intimacy is as much a duty as a pleasure. Failure to produce heirs can be grounds for annulment or, at the very least, cause for endless gossip. The girl knows this, though she couldn't explain the church's view of it if pressed. She only knows what's expected of her. An obscure tidbit drifts into your mind, something you heard in the alehouse once. In some regions, a marriage bed was blessed not just by a priest but by sprinkling it with salt and herbs to keep away evil spirits, or, more cynically, to keep away nosy relatives who might want to check in uninvited. Historians still debate whether these blessings were more superstition than sincere faith, though in practice, both often went hand in hand. After all, if a pinch of rosemary and a muttered prayer can't guarantee happiness, it can at least make the room smell better. Outside, the frost has deepened, silvering the edges of the fence posts. The girl's mother comes to stand beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. There's no grand speech, just a quiet, "You'll be fine." You can hear the unspoken part, "because you must be." Later, as you make your way back toward your own lodging, you pass the chapel again. The priest is inside, tidying away the remnants of the wedding blessing. Candles burn low in their holders, their wax pooling on the altar cloth. The faint scent of beeswax and cold stone clings to the air. The village is quiet now, save for the occasional burst of laughter from the wedding feast and the steady, unhurried creak of the old mill wool turning in the stream. You think of the bride's blue kirtle, the groom's iron knife, the goat in the corner of a newly married girl's home. These are the real symbols of medieval union, not jeweled crowns or silken veils, but bread, livestock, and the quiet negotiation between survival and sentiment. The night deepens, wrapping the village in its dark wool. You find your bed, the straw mattress shifting under your weight, the blanket heavy and smelling faintly of smoke. Somewhere marriages are beginning, somewhere others are ending, and here, in the quiet, you begin to drift, as the medieval world turns on in its slow, stubborn rhythm. Morning in the village is never truly quiet. Even before the sun has finished climbing past the low hills, there's the rhythm of work beginning. The dull thunk of an axe splitting wood, the wet scrape of a broom clearing mud from a doorstep, the uneven clop of a cartwheel with a loose rim. The smell of baking bread has already drifted into the lane, mingling with the sharper scent of dung from the byre. You follow a small stream toward the edge of the settlement, where a large timber-framed hall rises above the surrounding cottages like an elder among children. This is no royal castle, more the domain of a middling lord or well-off manor holder, but compared to the wattle and daub homes around it, the place feels almost ostentatious. Its roof is steep, tiled in weathered slate, and the carved beam ends are painted with faded swirls that might once have been bright red and green. Today, the hall is hosting a very different kind of wedding from the one you witnessed yesterday. Here, the bride isn't from a family scraping together a dowry in hens and spinning wheels. Her father's wealth comes from the wool trade, and the guest list includes more than one person wearing a belt buckle made of actual silver. You spot them as they arrive. Cloaks lined with fur, boots with tooled leather patterns, even the faint sparkle of a ring or two. The bride's gown is an ambitious thing. Layers of fine wool and linen spill to the floor, with a narrow band of embroidery at the hem depicting little curling vines. Her veil is long enough to require a maid to keep it from tangling underfoot, and her hair has been carefully braided into a crown beneath it. You notice her jewelry, a small brooch set with a bit of polished jet, and more tellingly, a girdle purse with a few silver coins clinking inside. That little purse is a statement in itself. She's not arriving in this marriage empty-handed. The groom is perhaps 10 years older, his wealth coming not from trade but from inherited land. His tunic is dyed a soft green, a color expensive enough to show off without screaming excess. He carries a pair of gloves in one hand, not because he needs them, but because fine gloves are as much about display as warmth. The way he nods politely to the guests without actually smiling tells you he's playing his part in a performance that's been rehearsed for weeks. This union isn't about two people finding one another. It's about two families aligning their interests. In a world where property laws and inheritance rules can turn disputes into open feuds, marriage is as much a contract as any parchment with a seal on it. In fact, the priest will read the terms of the dowry aloud before the vows, a reminder to all present that this is a matter of record as well as ritual. The hall is warm from the central hearth, though the air still carries the tang of smoke and roasting meat. Benches line the walls for guests, and at the far end, a trestle table has been set for the wedding party. On it rests a gilded cup that will be used for the couple's shared drink of spiced wine after the vows. A symbolic act meant to represent shared life, though it's also a handy excuse for a good sip before the feast. The ceremony is formal, almost brisk in its efficiency. The priest's Latin flows without hesitation, and the responses are clear but subdued, as though no one wants to risk stepping out of line. Rings are exchanged, simple gold bands, rare enough in this part of the country that they'll be spoken of in the market for weeks. Once the vows are complete, the feast begins almost immediately. You can tell by the way guests lean toward the serving boards that the food has been a subject of speculation. Roasted goose with crisp skin, trenchers of white bread, a luxury here, pottages thick with peas and herbs, and a dish of almond milk custard that makes 3 separate people mutter, fancy. But under the warm light and rich smells, you catch the quick, sidelong looks between the older men at the high table, the way they tilt their heads toward the new couple when they think no one is watching. These are the looks of people weighing their investment, calculating futures, and watching for the smallest signs that the alliance they've brokered will hold. It is festive, yes, but also faintly transactional. You leave before the last course, slipping out into the cold air where the sound of feasting dulls into a low, muffled hum. The night feels clearer here, under the stars, as if outside the hall's walls you can breathe a little easier. The next morning, frost bites harder. The grass crackles underfoot, and your breath rises in pale ribbons. You're heading toward the outer fields now, past the narrow strip of woodland that marks the edge of the Lord's hunting rights. The path is rutted, still half frozen, and you pass a boy leading a mule laden with bundles of firewood. Not far beyond the trees lies a small chapel, older than the village itself, its stone walls patched with mismatched mortar from centuries of repairs. It's here you come across another kind of union entirely, one not bound by dowry, property, or family politics. A young man and woman stand with the priest on the frozen grass. No witnesses except you and a robin that has decided the chapel roof is an acceptable perch. This is what's known as a clandestine marriage. Not exactly forbidden, but outside the ideal order of things. The church prefers public vows, banns announced in advance, the presence of a congregation, but it also teaches that mutual consent, once spoken, makes a marriage binding. That's the loophole. Two people can, in theory, marry themselves simply by declaring it aloud, provided no legal impediment exists. The priest here, grizzled and a little stooped, is more witness than officiant. The couple speaks in low voices, their words plain and without ornament. No rings, no feast, no fine clothes, just a promise, sealed with a shared drink from a small flask the man produces from his cloak. It smells faintly of cider. The woman laughs once, nervously, and tucks her hair behind her ear as though that single movement will steady her heart. Why do they choose this path? The reasons are many. Avoiding a disapproving family, sidestepping the cost of a formal ceremony, or simply wanting to marry quickly before gossip can complicate things. It's a quiet rebellion against the machinery of arranged unions, and though it carries risks, disputes over legitimacy, lack of formal record, it also allows for something rare in this age, a choice entirely their own. The priest murmurs a blessing, tracing a quick cross in the air, and the couple walks away together, arms brushing but not quite linked. They disappear into the trees, leaving no trace except two sets of footprints in the frost. You stand for a while longer, watching the robin hop along the chapel roofline. It pecks at a bit of lichen, tilts its head toward you, and then flits off toward the woods. In the stillness, you feel the peculiar intimacy of having been the sole witness to a moment meant to belong only to two people. The path back toward the village seems longer than usual. The air is sharper, the sky paler. Somewhere, the great machinery of alliances and dowries continues to turn, but here, at least for a moment, you've seen the small, stubborn pulse of something else entirely. You wake to the sound of hens, argumentative ones, right outside your window. Someone is trying to drive them back toward their coop, but the hens have strong opinions about this plan. Their voices mix with the clatter of a bucket and the muttered curses of whoever is on hen duty this morning. You pull on your cloak and step outside into the damp, early light. This market day again. The road leading into the village has already begun to hum with traffic. Pack horses burdened with sacks of grain, a cart piled high with wicker baskets, a woman carrying a large clay jar balanced easily on her hip. And then there's you, weaving into the slow stream of people heading toward the square, as if you've always belonged here. In the market's open space, a crowd gathers around a makeshift stage of planks on barrels. On it stands a man with an air of theatrical authority, one arm linked with a woman whose face is unreadable. The man's other hand holds up a thick cord of braided hemp. You realize this isn't a play. It's a public reconciliation. The cord is a marriage rope, and the couple is here to prove they are, despite recent disputes, still bound to each other. You hear whispers from those beside you. The husband accused the wife of neglecting her duties. The wife accused the husband of squandering their goods at the alehouse. The cord, looped loosely around both their wrists, is a visual metaphor, tying them together again for better or worse. The man with the rope speaks in a voice pitched for the crowd. They have agreed, he says, to return to the keeping of their vows. The couple repeats short phrases after him, something about honest living, obedience, and patience, words that feel as much for the onlookers as for themselves. You know the public nature of it is deliberate. Marriage is not simply private. It's a community matter, because disputes can spill into property claims, feuds, or even violence. The public reconciliation is meant to settle gossip, to make the couple accountable not just to each other but to the eyes and ears of everyone who shops at this market. When it's over, the rope is removed and the pair walk off together, not holding hands exactly but at least keeping the same pace. Some in the crowd smile approvingly. Others roll their eyes, muttering bets on how long it will last. As the market resumes its normal bustle, you linger at a spice seller's stall. The sharp scent of cloves mixes with the sweetness of cinnamon. The seller offers you a tiny taste of something rare, candied fennel seeds, used to freshen breath and aid digestion. Good for married couples, he says with a sly smile, and you almost choke trying not to laugh. Somewhere between the hens, the hemp rope, and the candied seeds, you realize marriage here is not a fixed thing. It's an ongoing negotiation, and sometimes a very public performance. By the time the sun has dipped low, you find yourself walking along the narrow lane that leads to the mill. The water wheel turns with a steady groan, the sound underscored by the rush of the stream. The miller's wife is outside, hanging linens on a line strung between two leaning posts. She's tall, her sleeves rolled to the elbows, her hair pinned back with no pretense of ornament. You pause to greet her, and she waves you closer. He's inside, she says, meaning the miller. But don't trip on the flour sacks. He never moves them where I ask. She speaks with the easy authority of someone who runs as much of the household business as her husband, perhaps more. Inside, the air is thick with the fine dust of ground grain, and the miller is bent over a ledger, a stub of charcoal in hand. He straightens when he sees you. Ah, come to see the real work of a marriage? He asks, half smiling. You soon realize he doesn't mean the grinding of grain. The miller and his wife have been married more than 2 decades, and they treat the daily running of the mill as a joint enterprise. He handles the weights, measures, and accounts. She manages the workers, keeps the household supplied, and negotiates with farmers for their custom. We argue, she admits cheerfully, but it's over whether to mend the sluice gate now or wait until spring, not over anything that will ruin us. In a time when many marriages are built on inequality, where a husband's authority is legally and socially reinforced, this one feels almost like a partnership of necessity. The mill simply couldn't run if they weren't both pulling their weight. And in this little corner of medieval life, necessity breeds something that resembles respect. Over a cup of thin ale, the miller tells you about the mill marriage oath, a local custom in which couples working together in a trade pledge not only fidelity but fair dealing. If I cheat a farmer on the weights, he says, she'll hear about it first, and she'll make me regret it. His wife, returning with a fresh loaf of rye bread, smirks at this and adds, and if I do the same, he'd sell the wheel and be done with me. They laugh together in a way that tells you these are not idle threats. They're the sort of jokes built on trust. Outside, as you leave, you glance back at the water wheel turning against the dusk. It's slow, steady, and a little creaky, but it never stops, not unlike the rhythm of a long, weathered marriage. The evening turns colder, and the air smells faintly of smoke from hearths being stoked for the night. You follow a narrow lane that bends like a question mark toward a small timber-framed house. Its shutters are half closed, lamplight spilling in soft strips onto the muddy ground. You knock gently. Inside, the hum of a spinning wheel fades, and a voice calls for you to enter. A woman, perhaps in her late 30s, sits by the fire with wool in her lap. Her husband is beside her, mending a wooden stool, his fingers moving with slow precision. The quiet here is companionable, the kind you feel in couples who have learned that speaking constantly isn't the same as understanding each other. On the low table between them is a narrow jar of oil and a small pewter dish. The woman notices your glance. "Rosemary oil," she says simply, as though that explains everything. Doesn't. But then she adds, "keeps away fleas and other things." It's a gentle admission. In a world without private bathrooms or much soap, rosemary oil is both perfume and protection. And in the flicker of firelight, you notice the way she dips her fingers into the oil, rubbing it into her wrists, then handing it to her husband, who does the same. There's a rhythm to it, an intimacy in the repetition that feels like its own quiet ritual. They speak of the marriage bed with the same practicality they speak of storing grain or mending roofs. Privacy is limited, and the household includes her younger sister and an elderly aunt, meaning any ahem physical moments must be timed carefully. Night is safest, her husband says with a slight grin. If no one is awake to hear the floorboards creak. You've read that in some medieval households, couples shared beds not just with each other but with children, servants, or guests. Here, the couple has a rope strung between two beams, with a wool blanket draped over it to make a sort of curtain. Not much, she admits, but it helps. They don't pretend every night is a candlelit romance. Sometimes it's too cold, or someone's back aches, or the children wake at the worst possible moment. But what they have, this mixture of routine, patience, and stolen pockets of privacy, feels like its own kind of survival. As you step outside again, the rosemary scent clings to your sleeve, and you suspect that in 100 years, a historian might debate whether it was for love, for comfort, or simply to keep the fleas at bay. Later, the moon sits high and pale over the village, and you're walking along the path toward the manor. The Lord's Hall glows faintly ahead, its windows streaked with frost. Inside, The air is warm with the smell of roasted meat and beeswax candles. This is a different world, where marriage is not about survival through shared labor, but about property, alliances, and political usefulness. At the high table sits Lady Isolde, her gown a waterfall of deep blue wool, lined with fur. Her husband, Lord Bernard, is away again, attending to business in another shire. In his absence, she entertains the steward and a few visiting clergy. Her smile is pleasant, but her eyes move often to the doorway, as though expecting someone. You hear whispers at the servants' end of the hall. The marriage was arranged when she was 15, he nearly twice her age. They've produced 3 children, 2 surviving. Their union is neither especially warm nor openly cold. It's simply an arrangement that functions. He controls the estates, she manages the household in his absence. It's a business partnership wrapped in the language of matrimony. But here's the strange thing. Even in a marriage arranged for politics, certain rules of intimacy still exist. The steward tells you, with some embarrassment, about the morning gift, a custom where the groom presents his bride with land, jewels, or goods the day after their wedding night. It's meant to secure her future, but also to signal that the marriage has been consummated. Without that, the union could be challenged or annulled. There are rumors, delicate ones, that Lady Isolde and Lord Bernard live almost entirely separate lives, meeting only when the expectation of producing another heir becomes pressing. She spends more time with her ladies-in-waiting, embroidery frame in hand, talking quietly in corners. The steward says this is normal. In noble circles, affection is optional, heirs are not. You watch as she gestures for a servant to pour wine into your cup. A long winter ahead, she says softly. You realize she isn't speaking of the weather. The hall around her is full of warmth and food, but her eyes hold a kind of patient resignation, a reminder that in medieval marriage, even luxury can feel like a gilded cage. As you leave, the night air bites harder than before, and the sound of the manor's gate closing behind you feels final, like a chapter ending. Somewhere far off, a watchman calls the hour. In a village where beds are shared, ropes serve as curtains, and rosemary oil wards off more than pests. You've now glimpsed the spectrum of marriage, from necessity to alliance, from survival to duty. The next morning, frost silvercoats every rooftop, and your breath floats in soft clouds as you walk toward the edge of the village. Here, beyond the last thatched cottages, a narrow path leads to a small chapel half hidden by bare oaks. The bell is not ringing, but the door stands open, and inside, the light is pale and thin, filtering through glass painted with saints. The priest, Father Alan, is bent over a desk of rough oak, his quill scratching against parchment. He looks up with a mild smile, motioning you inside. His voice is soft, but his words are deliberate. Today, he's copying a sermon from Latin into the local tongue, a sermon about the dangers of improper union. He doesn't elaborate yet, but you can guess what that means. In the Middle Ages, the Church held considerable sway over how people thought about marriage and intimacy. A wedding wasn't just a social arrangement. It was a sacrament, a religious bond sealed under the eyes of God and, ideally, the priest. Yet the rules about when and how a married couple could be together were dizzyingly specific. Father Alan explains, with a faint sigh, that there are prohibited times. Advent, Lent, certain feast days, Sundays, days when technically intimacy was forbidden for the sake of piety. You try to count the days in a year that aren't on that list, and the answer is not many. He chuckles quietly, perhaps at your expression, perhaps because even he knows the rules are often ignored. One strange tidbit he shares is about the marriage debt. It wasn't debt in the modern sense, but rather the idea that each spouse owed the other their body. If one asked, the other was expected to agree, unless, of course, it was one of those prohibited days. And if you think that's romantic, Father Alan assures you it was framed entirely in terms of obligation, not candlelit passion. He pauses his quill, looking thoughtful. Historians still debate whether these rules were strictly followed or just politely nodded at, he admits. You suspect it's the latter. Humans have a long history of bending rules when the rules make little sense in the cold of winter. The chapel smells faintly of beeswax and damp stone. You run your fingers along the wooden pew, thinking of all the whispered confessions and carefully worded questions the priest must hear. Is it a sin to? Should we wait until? The answers are rarely simple. In a world where love, duty, and faith are tightly braided together, even the most personal moments are subject to outside judgment. You step back into the cold air, carrying the image of that cramped desk and the weary priest who, perhaps more than anyone, knows that human hearts rarely obey the calendar. By afternoon, the clouds are low and heavy, the kind that make you feel as though the sky is leaning down to listen. You take a winding track toward a small cluster of cottages near a stream. Here lives a woman known not by her given name, but simply as Goodwife Maud. She's no official healer, no license, no church blessing, but half the village comes to her for advice on everything from sour milk to sour marriages. Her house is warm and dim, the air thick with the smell of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. She greets you with a nod, placing a small pot of something steaming on the hearth. Without asking, she begins to talk about how people misunderstand love, how desire is tangled in superstition and fear. Some men, she says, leaning close, will carry a sprig of yarrow in their shoe to make their wives more willing. She says this without a flicker of humor, as though yarrow's magic is a plain fact. Others, she says, believe a charm of knotted red thread placed under the marriage bed will ensure fertility. And there are whispers, only whispers, about potions brewed from strange roots, meant to make a husband or wife less inclined to stray. These are not things you'd hear from Father Alan. These are folk beliefs, passed from neighbor to neighbor, folded into daily life so naturally that no one stops to ask where they came from. The church might call them superstition. The villagers might call them common sense. You notice a worn wooden chest in the corner. When Maud opens it, you glimpse bundles of herbs, small cloth pouches, and, unexpectedly, a folded scrap of parchment covered in symbols. She explains it's a charm against the wandering eye, meant to keep a spouse faithful. Whether it works, she shrugs. Sometimes belief is enough. One odd fact she shares, delivered as casually as mentioning the weather, is that in some villages, people believe eating certain foods will influence the gender of a child. More meat, more boys, more dairy, more girls. Nonsense, she says, even as she sprinkles herbs into the pot without measuring. The steam curls toward the rafters, carrying a scent of fennel and sage. You realize that in the medieval mind, The boundaries between medicine, magic, and marriage were thin. Love was not left entirely to chance. It was nudged, coaxed, or guarded through rituals both holy and decidedly not. As you leave, Maud presses a sprig of rosemary into your hand. Not for fleas this time, but to remind you that someone is thinking of you. Whether she means herself or someone else, you don't ask. The stream beside her house murmurs softly as you walk away, and you think about how much of medieval marriage existed in that quiet space between the sacred and the secret. The next day begins with a thin winter sun, the kind that makes the frost glint like powdered glass on every field. You take the long way toward the market square, partly because the air is crisp and clear, and partly because you want to pass the blacksmith shop. Not for horseshoes or hinges, but for a story. Because here, among the clang of hammer on iron, you've heard a curious rumor. One you suspect has been embroidered a little with each retelling. The blacksmith, Master Gerard, sets down his hammer and wipes his brow, grinning when you ask about it. "You mean the belts," he says, with the sort of smirk that tells you he enjoys watching you squirm. Chastity belts. The very phrase sounds medieval because it is, but not in the way most imagine. You see, the popular picture of jealous husbands locking away their wives before leaving for war is, in truth, more myth than daily reality. While metal devices did exist, historians believe most were later curiosities, moral warnings, or elaborate jokes. The evidence of actual long-term use is, shall we say, thin. Master Gerard admits he's made one or two, commissioned not as restraints but as novelty items for noble households with more money than good sense. He claims one particularly vain lord ordered a belt studded with brass roses, which, frankly, sounds more like an uncomfortable conversation starter than a practical tool. One obscure tidbit he shares, lowering his voice, is that in certain festivals, actors would parade wearing fake chastity belts as part of morality plays. The crowd would roar with laughter at the exaggerated locks and ridiculous keys. Historians still debate whether any of them were meant to be serious. Gerard says, shaking his head, "If they were, I pity the wearer." You lean against the doorway, watching the sparks fly from the forge. Here is a reminder that not all medieval ideas about sex were purely moral or purely functional. Some were satirical, designed to poke fun at human jealousy and folly. Even then, people could laugh at their own hypocrisies. As you leave, Gerard calls after you with a chuckle. "If you want one made, it'll cost you extra for the brass roses." You wave him off, but the image stays in your mind. Proof that even the strangest medieval facts might have been part joke, part cautionary tale, and part very bad fashion choice. By late afternoon, you find yourself at the edge of the manor's orchard. The branches are bare now, but you can still imagine the summer's apples and pears. Today, however, the orchard is the scene of something far less sweet. A small, tense gathering around a wooden table. It's a court session, presided over by the Lord Steward, and the case is not about theft or trespass, but about marriage. Specifically, whether it is even valid. A husband stands on one side, his arms folded. His wife stands on the other, her hands clasped, eyes downcast. The claim that their marriage was never properly consummated, and therefore, in the eyes of both church and law, might be annulled. You realize this is not just gossip. This is the real machinery of medieval marriage law. Consummation wasn't merely a personal matter. It was a legal requirement. Without it, inheritance, property rights, and family alliances could crumble. And yes, sometimes such cases required witnesses to speak on what should have been entirely private affairs. The steward listens patiently, asking careful questions. The husband mutters about illness. The wife says little, but her glance is sharp. A neighbor is called to testify, not about what they saw, thankfully, but about whether they believed the couple lived as man and wife. Here's your obscure fact for the day. In some regions, medieval law allowed for something called a trial by Congress, where an accused couple might be examined, not in front of a crowd, thank heaven, to prove physical capability. Most historians agree this was rare, and even then the accounts are uncomfortably clinical. Historians still debate whether these trials were genuinely pursued or mostly threatened as leverage. Someone whispers beside you. You suspect it's the latter, given how quickly the steward wraps things up today, dismissing the case and advising the couple to resolve matters privately. As they walk away, you can't help noticing the orchard around you. The quiet rows of trees, their branches interlaced like fingers. Marriage here is both public and private, binding and fragile, a contract as much as a companionship. The sun dips lower, and you step away from the gathering, your breath curling into the cold air. You can almost hear the faint rustle of last autumn's leaves, whispering that love, in any century, is a complicated thing to legislate. The evening arrives quietly, with a sky the color of faded parchment. You wander back toward the village, the air carrying the faint smell of wood smoke and baking bread. Somewhere, a lute is playing soft, hesitant notes drifting out from the alehouse door. Tonight, you've been invited to sit with an older woman named Matilda, who everyone calls Aunt, though she is related to almost no one. Her cottage is warm, lit by a single beeswax candle and the embers of a low fire. She has been a midwife for decades, and she has seen more of medieval life, birth, marriage, and death, than most ever will. She pours you a cup of thin ale and begins to talk, not about scandal or sin, but about the reality behind so much of what you've heard these past days. She speaks of the quiet endurance of women, of the ways people navigated a world where the church and custom dictated so much of one's body and choices. She tells you that love sometimes found a way in spite of rules, and that people, being people, still laughed, still whispered, still hoped. Your major historical fact here. In many towns, midwives like Matilda were required to swear oaths before local authorities, promising to report births, baptisms, and any signs of illegitimacy. This meant they were not just caretakers but also record keepers in a society where lineage was everything. Matilda leans back, her voice dropping lower. She shares an obscure tidbit: how some women would wear charms stitched into their gowns, small packets of herbs or written prayers meant to encourage affection or fertility. The church frowned on such things, she says with a sly smile. But the church wasn't in the bedchamber, was it? You both laugh softly, though the sound fades into the long, thoughtful silence that follows. Outside, the wind moves through the bare hedgerows, a sound like the distant sea. Matilda's gaze lingers on the fire, and she says something you're not sure is meant for you or herself. Love is always older than the rules. You thank her, stepping back into the chill night. The village is quiet now, the only light coming from the high windows of the church. The path home feels longer, but your mind is full, not just with facts and customs, but with faces, voices, and the unshakable sense that history is made up as much of small moments as grand events. And so, the day ends, and with it, our long wandering through the winding lanes and unspoken rules of medieval life. The moon has risen, pale and round, slipping between soft banks of cloud, casting silver over the thatched roofs and quiet streets. You walk slowly now, each step measured, as if the cobblestones themselves are encouraging you to rest. The air is cool but not sharp, carrying the smell of damp earth and the faint sweetness of hay stored for winter. Somewhere in the darkness, a barn owl calls, its voice low and haunting. The houses you pass are dark, save for the occasional candle flickering in an upstairs window. Behind those shutters, people sleep curled beneath heavy wool, dreams stitched from the day's labors and tomorrow's uncertainties. The same moon that touches your path touches theirs, the same night holding every breath in the same soft quiet. You reach the edge of the village, where the fields begin, their frost-tipped grasses bending under the weight of the season. The hedgerows are still, except for a few stubborn leaves that rattle in the wind. The road ahead stretches into shadow, but there is no hurry. Not tonight. In the distance, you can see the faint glow of your own hearth, waiting. You imagine the comfort of stepping inside, loosening your cloak, and feeling the warmth wrap itself around you. The day's stories settle in your mind like embers in a grate, still glowing, still giving off their gentle light. You breathe in deeply, and the night exhales back. The world feels slower now, its edges softened. The voices of the market, the clang of the forge, the whispered secrets in orchard and hall, they all drift further away, replaced by the steady hush of the countryside at rest. And as you step inside, the door closing quietly behind you, you realize there is nothing left to do but let the stillness take you. The candlelight sways gently, the shadows soften, and your thoughts grow lighter, slower, until they, too, drift away into the quiet. Sleep well.